Hi, Father Tony.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing great. Welcome to Meaning of Life.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting conversation today. We're talking about Gnosticism, and you are Father Tony Silvia, priest in the Apostolic Johannite Church,
Hmm.
which is a Gnostic church. It's international, I believe. Is that correct? It's
Yep.
global?
Hmm.
You are also the executive director of the Gnostic Wisdom Network, which produces media about Gnostic topics.
Yep.
And you are the author of Sanctuary of the Sacred Flame, a guide to Johannite spiritual practice. So I am excited to get into this topic with you today. It's a big topic, as I realized as I started looking into this. There are a few specific things that I'd like to discuss. The Demiurge, which I think is a big part of Gnostic belief, or at least some
Hmm.
Gnostic belief. Gnosis and what that experience is, and then some specific practices. But I want to start by just giving people a general sense of what Gnosticism is. And, there's kind of a basic historical story here, as I
Hmm.
understand it. It's that it was Gnosticism is or at least a Christian movement, early Christian movement. Is that
So,
correct? Yeah.
some say it's pre-Christian, but there's not a lot of hard evidence to make that claim.
Uh
But it's all kind of
huh. It's tough to tell. It's from
yeah.
my research. It's like I said. It's a broad topic. We'll maybe get into why that is. But so it started maybe around the second century, I guess.
Hmm.
And it was declared heretical by the Christian Church. Uh, and
More specifically than it wasn't exactly declared heretical by the Christian Church because there
uh,
really wasn't one by the time Gnosticism
true.
kind of faded from popularity. I like to say that it more or less just lost the popularity contest among the various versions of Christianity that
Okay.
were present in the early church. People just drifted away from Gnosticism before any of the real kind of any of the ecumenical councils or any of the other kind of orthodoxizing, if that's a word, of the Christian church. So,
Okay. And yeah, this is. I mean, that you see a lot of mixing of different early uh, religious beliefs, I think, in
mhm.
Gnosticism. Um, and in any case, you see Gnostic ideas popping up in a lot of different places. And so what I originally thought was maybe a little bit more straightforward than it is seemed kind of fuzzy as I was looking into this. So this leads me to ask you, how do you define Gnosticism?
Well, for me, Gnosticism is a family of religious traditions that have at its core the pursuit of gnosis. And so here's where we define gnosis, I suppose. the the way that most people would define gnosis is it is a kind of experiential knowledge of the divine, a kind of personal knowing that involves um, understanding the reality of the world in a way that you previously hadn't. It's often very personal and very hard to describe. But generally speaking, it falls into a kind of enlightenment-like state. Although I think that enlightenment as a Buddhist term is talking about something slightly different, but it's similar enough that you can use a lot of the same terms to talk about it.
Hmm. And is this a state that one can reach multiple times, or is it sort of like an end goal?
No, actually, it's a starting point.
Ah,
It's it is very difficult to maintain a state of awareness that one would call gnosis. It's kind of a plateau experience. The Typically what happens is you have these flashes of insight, and then you go to work the next day and you pay your bills and you do all those things that you do, and then depending on who you are, you spend the rest of your life kind of either hoping to get back to that or hoping to build upon that.
hmm. So gnosis is not a particularly common experience. Then it's something that
I don't know actually how common it is. I think that a lot of people might have experiences like this and just dismiss it. I think that probably happens more often than we know. Um, that they say, "Oh, I'm just, maybe I'm going crazy, or maybe I have, I drank too much, or I had a weird dream or something." But I think it probably happens to a lot of people who don't know what kind of a category to even put it in, so it just kind of goes away and they don't think about it again.
So is it like a flash of insight into the true nature of reality? Is that maybe a fair way of describing it?
Yeah, I would say so, and that takes a very broad, a very broad spectrum of specific, I guess you'd say, symbols. When that does happen, the general Gnostic cosmology is that the world has been created by a less than perfect creator God, and there is a more perfect reality above that we are striving to attain. And whether people see that as a kind of a demiurge figure, or whether they see it as, the system, the man, or whatever the term gets put in that spot, they understand that is one level of reality, but that there's a higher level of reality that we can achieve if we work real hard.
Okay, and so the gnosis is a kind of union with that higher level reality.
Yeah, and more of an understanding than a union, because
okay.
at the heart of it, we realize, and this is fairly common to most gnosis experiences, that we realize that we have always been in union with the divine, but we have filters in place to prevent us from realizing that. And gnosis is when those filters fall away.
Okay. It sounds vaguely Hindu.
Sure, yep.
Yeah.
I think it's a universal experience, and I think it gets called different things by different cultures.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. This is one thing that I've frequently thought about various spiritual experiences that, though they get called different things and described in slightly different ways, it seems that they may really be describing something that's really very much the same thing.
Yeah, people are people.
Yeah, it makes sense kind of from a scientific perspective if you assume shared biological structures and so forth, that people would be achieving similar states even through different practices. So I guess that's kind of the succinct version of what Gnostic belief is. So if it's a family of traditions, right? And so I guess I was going to ask you where Gnosticism departs from mainstream Christianity. Is that...
Yeah. Well, yeah, so you can say that... well, let me back up. If you were to go to a Johannite service today, it looks very Catholic. It appears we have the same sacraments. They take the same forms. We use different words and we think about things in a different way. But if you were, say, a Protestant going to a Roman Catholic church and then going to a Johannite church, you'd say, "Oh, those are kind of the same thing." Where it departs in a modern sense is that we take kind of a more internal view of, or we try and understand things on a more internal level, a more esoteric level than the strictly exoteric literalist view that a lot of mainline Christians today take. That's very broad and overgeneralizing, of course, but we got to start somewhere. Yeah. In the ancient world, Gnosticism varied from what was becoming the Orthodox Christianity, specifically by the introduction of the figure of the Demiurge to the creation mythos, in an attempt to solve the age-old problem of theodicy, the problem of evil. The Platonists and the Middle Platonists and the Neoplatonists were working on where does evil start in the emanations from the world of ideals down to the world of forms, and evil happens somewhere in between there, because if this is perfect and this is imperfect, where does imperfection start? the Neoplatonists created a Demiurge figure as well, or the Platonists created a Demiurge figure as well, who was less than perfect but still benign. The Gnostics took that concept and kind of ran with it and said, well, he's certainly less than perfect, but he's also not very benign either. He's a bit malefic, and he and his kind of alternate heaven are trying to keep us from gnosis, trying to keep us from realizing that there is another higher God above him, and hence the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm. So this is you said the Demiurge is the creator God in Gnostic belief?
Yeah, generally speaking, yes. The Gnostic creation myth, just to briefly go through it, there is a divine figure that is kind of ineffable, an alien god is how it gets referred to a lot, the invisible father, and it doesn't have characteristics in the sense that other created things have characteristics. It's used apophatic and cataphatic theology to kind of get around what that invisible father is, but you can never really get to it. Through a series of emanations, a number of beings called Aeons are created, and these are kind of like the heavenly realm. They might be considered angels in an analogous system.
Okay.
And these Aeons are perfect. And they have their kind of fullness of perfection in this divine realm. However, at one point, the last emanation, Sophia, or wisdom, the Greek word for wisdom, decides to create something by herself without following the divine plan. That creation becomes the Demiurge. It is considered, an abortion, a deformed being that is just entirely evil. And this evil creator doesn't understand what came before it, so he says, I am a jealous God and there is no God before me. And says, I'm going to make some things that are going to worship me. So he creates these Archons, which might be considered demons. And between himself and the Archons, they create the material world in order to have essentially worshippers.
I see, okay. And is this taken in a... I'm sure it varies from person to person and from tradition to tradition. Is it taken in a literal kind of sense, or is this seen as a metaphor?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
And, not only does it go back and forth but person to person, but even my own personal understanding of it changes minute to minute. So who knows? I mean, It's tough to say. That these forces certainly do have a reality of their own, whether they are literal sky lizard alien beings that control the world, or whether they're just kind of the way the world works, it is kind of irrelevant to the way that you interact with them anyway. So whether they're literal, awful, demonic beings or not terribly important, in my opinion. Okay.
So I guess picking up on how you interact with them, can we talk a little bit about that and about maybe some of the rituals that make up Gnostic practice?
Sure. And this has changed dramatically over the 2,000 years that Gnosticism has existed, of course.
Really? Surprising.
The early Gnostics fell into a number of categories, a number of individual groups. The largest were the Sethians and the Valentinians, and to a lesser degree the Mandaeans and the Manichaeans are sometimes considered Gnostic, sometimes not, but depending on which scholar you talk to. But the Sethians and the Valentinians shared a similar cosmology. They shared that creation myth to a certain extent, but they varied a lot in their approach to where they fit in and how evil any of these beings were. The Sethians were kind of the punk rock Gnostics, and they really believed that the Demiurge was absolutely evil, and the Archons were absolutely out to get us, and we have to do everything that we can to transcend them. The Valentinians were much nicer, and they thought that the Demiurge was just a little slow, and maybe he could be redeemed with the rest of us if we all work together, and hugs and puppies and all that. So what the Sethians were doing was probably looked a lot like, and scholars have been working on this, scholars like April DeConnick and others, so probably looked a lot like a kind of Masonic lodge type ritual or a magical lodge type ritual, where they would meet together and they would have these esoteric rituals, which we don't know a whole lot about, but there are references to them in the texts. Their main kind of ritual would be the 5 seals, which is probably some kind of baptism ritual that involves an anointing with oil or something like that, and probably wouldn't have looked out of place with what other religious groups of the time were doing. The Valentinians, on the other hand, were going to church with all the other Christians, but then they would go to somebody's living room after the Mass and have a little secret meeting about, okay, when the priest said this, here's what he really meant. So Irenaeus, one of the heresy hunters, really hated the Valentinians because he says, well, look, they say they're Christian and you can't tell them apart from the real Christians, so it's really hard to root out that heresy. So Irenaeus didn't like the Valentinians very much. And then in the modern expressions of Christianity, of Gnosticism, it looks a lot like kind of mainstream Christianity on the outside, for the most part. There are as many Gnostic churches and as many Gnostic bishops as there are, there are a lot of them, let's say. As is true with all of the independent sacramental church movement stuff that's happening these days. Some churches are larger and more vibrant, and some churches are one dude in his living room with a laptop and a website. So the various ways that Gnosticism is practiced today varies a lot as well. But for most people most churches that do have public rituals, it looks a lot like a Eucharist service that you'd see at a Roman or an Orthodox church.
Okay. And you pointed to one particular ritual as particularly important in the Johannite Church. I think it is the service of the Logos.
Yeah, so that is it's not a ritual that we okay, let me start again.
This was in your book. I think
I know. Yeah. So the service of the Logos, the reason why I put that in the book is because it is the ritual that anybody can do.
Okay.
It's essentially, we took parts out of our regular liturgy and pulled them out and stuck together a kind of a smaller prayer service that reflects our liturgical worship, but is smaller and can be done on a small scale on a personal level. So while it is an important reflection of what we do as a community, and a lot of Johannites today do use the Logo service in some form or another. The most important thing for us is still the Eucharist.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. All right. And the service of the Logos, that involved invoking various of these beings, and then a kind of prayer or meditation. Mm-hmm. Correct.
Yes, the invocation is of the archangels of the 4 classical Greek elements, which is typically found in other ritual magic or esoteric lodge systems. You might find similar stuff in the Golden Dawn or other groups like that. So in a sense, our church isn't, strictly speaking, a Gnostic church. Our church is an esoteric Gnostic Christian church. And so we draw on all of those influences. And that particular part of the invocation of the archangels comes out of a more hermetic magical tradition that a lot of the occult revival and Gnostic revival churches drew on that kind of thing, because when they were all forming in the late 1800s or the early 1800s, depending on which group, they did not have access to the Gnostic texts themselves. All they had access to were what the Gnostics were what the people who hated the Gnostics were saying about them. Mm-hmm. People like Irenaeus and the other heresy hunters. So in 1945, when the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered, we learned a lot about what the Gnostics actually did for themselves. But the churchy version of Gnosticism actually didn't change that much based on that discovery. It was still a very much it looked like a Christian worship service with some 19th century occultism spread over the top of it.
Yeah, I when I was reading about what the service looked like, it did remind me a lot of what you see in pagan, a lot of pagan rituals or
Sure.
Occultic rituals now. You call the four spirits and light candles, and there's kind of a meditative aspect to it.
Yeah, there's nothing new under the sun. Everybody steals from everybody.
And this was an interesting point. Is I think when, as I understand it, when Gnosticism was getting its start, I guess, there were a lot of, this was, early in Christianity, and there was this big mix of religious practices and ideas, and it seems like people were borrowing all kinds of rituals and ideas from each other. And for instance, if you look at Manichaeans, as you said, some people consider them Gnostics, other people don't. But there's kind of a mirror, it seems like to me, between their conception of cosmology, where you have this, the world of material things is kind of like a world of darkness, and then you have opposing it a world of light, kind of like the Demiurge and, what did you call the higher?
The Aeons and
the Aeons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, there's absolutely a lot of similarities. That where scholars will say Manichaeanism is not specifically Gnostic is that there's it's a different kind of dualism. Dualism is a word that gets thrown around a lot when you talk about Gnosticism, and for most people who study Gnosticism kind of on a surface level or just read the Heresy Hunters, they understand the Gnostic dualism to be a strict kind of matter-spirit dichotomy. Like, matter is 100% bad and spirit is 100% good. But if you read the Gnostics themselves, they certainly didn't believe that. It was more of a spectrum and a mixing than the strictly black and white interpretation of the people who don't like us.
And so what is is there a conception of heaven in Gnosticism as there is in, say, Christianity, mainstream Christianity?
After a fashion, and again, you ask two Gnostics, you get three different opinions, but generally speaking, so let's talk about the Sethians, because they're kind of my guys. Okay. The Sethians believed that the souls pre-existed in the Pleroma, in the land of the Aeons, or the era of the Aeons, depending on how you want to refer to it. That souls were, spit into bodies at birth, and they would go off and do their thing. And then when they died, depending on whether or not they were born into a specific genetic tradition, really, then they would return to one of four different buckets of souls that existed in a heaven-like realm. But they don't really describe what that was like. The Gnostics are pretty famous for not being very clear about the afterlife. So, but yeah, and the Sethians were probably the strictest about who went where and when and why. And the Valentinians were also, to a certain extent, they believed that humanity fell into three different categories: the Hilic, the Psychic, and the Pneumatic. And the Hilics were the people who were all in the body, and they didn't really think very much, and they were just kind of on autopilot and did their thing. The Psychics were what they would consider, in their language, the regular Christians, the people who would go to Mass on Sunday and then go home. And the Pneumatics were the spiritual elect, the people who went to Mass and then went to these Valentinian meetings afterwards. And there's some debate as to whether they thought that was a predetermined thing, or whether or not they thought that you could move between one and the other. When I use that symbol set, I do tend to think that I exist in all three of those various buckets at any given time. So just sometimes I feel a little bit better about it than others.
So are there similarities between, can you call that a kind... I'm thinking about salvation here, and the sort of mainline view of salvation is, you end up in heaven and so on. Is Gnosis a kind of seen as salvation in Gnostic practice?
Generally speaking, yes. There's a text called the Excerpt from Theodotus, and we like this particular clip of it because it really kind of describes, for the most part, how we feel about it. It says, "What makes us free is the gnosis of who we were, of where we were, of what we have become, of where to we speed, of where from we are redeemed, of what birth truly is, and of what rebirth truly is." And in a sense, boiling that down, gnosis saves you in that it points you in that direction, and it says, "Look, now that you've seen the truth, this is where you should be heading. And if not, then you're going to end up in the same situation that everybody else is in." I think of it as a kind of self-selecting elitism, almost, that anybody can experience gnosis and anybody can have these mystical experiences, and they don't have to happen in a religious context. I mean, the famous story of Philip K. Dick, who had his wisdom teeth out and had a pink beam of light shoot into his head due to maybe the pain or whatever, but or the drugs, probably the drugs. Who was not having a religious day at that time. He was in a pretty bad mood, and he had this gnosis experience and spent the rest of his life trying to figure out what happened to him. So anybody can have these experiences, and anybody can choose whether to pursue it or not. And those who choose to pursue it will make it to whatever Gnostic afterlife that exists or not.
Whatever it looks like or doesn't.
Yeah. G.I. Gurdjieff has a pretty good way of looking at it, and it's kind of the way that I'm partial to. He believes that people have the potential to have immortal souls, but they aren't born with them. That you have to do the spiritual work that will build a soul that will survive your physical life. And I think the Gnostics would have kind of jived with that. The ancient Gnostics would have jived with that.
Yeah, that's an interesting view of it. I want to ask you a little bit about the history of the Johannite Church and where it kind of draws its roots from, and how it's oriented towards in Gnostic, the spectrum of Gnostic beliefs.
Well, there are two incarnations of the Johannite Church. The first began in the early 1800s in France. A gentleman by the name of Bernard Raymond Fabre Pelleprat was a Freemason and according to him, a Knights Templar in the lineage of the ancient Knights Templar who had been destroyed some 500 years or so before. It was his claim, and he had some documents that he would trot out to back up his claim, that the Knights Templar Grand Mastership was actually passed on from Jacques de Molay in prison to this guy named Jean-Marc Larmanius. The document is called the Larmanius Charter as a result, and it lists the Grand Masters of the Knights Templar from Jean-Marc Larmanius to Bernard Raymond Fabre Pelleprat, who trotted it out and said, "Hey, look, I'm the guy, and you should all be Knights Templar with me." And in the beginning, that was also he was an interesting cat. He was a member of Napoleon's court. He was Napoleon's official foot doctor. He was a doctor, and he pioneered an awful lot of interesting medical research into electricity as well, using electricity in medical treatments, which none of which we still use today. But
probably a good thing we don't.
At any rate, so this guy was fairly influential in Paris at the time, and he had the support of Napoleon to kind of bring this Knights Templar organization, quote unquote, out of the shadows. Now, if you're not catching that I don't necessarily buy this story, I don't necessarily buy this story, but it's interesting nonetheless. And I don't think at the end of the day it's super relevant whether he is actually the guy who was in charge of the Knights Templar, although some people get really hung up on it. At any rate, after a few years, he discovered a book called the Leviticon or the Evangelicon, depending on which source you read. And this book contained a version of the Gospel of John that was slightly different in some telling ways from the version of the Gospel of John that was available to them at the time. This document also contained some rituals and some important ways that priests would behave in this Johannite Church, and so he decided that the Knights Templar would become a Johannite organization, and this church would be developed to support this Knights Templar. According to our legend, this church always existed within the Knights Templar, but again, who knows?
Yeah.
According to Fabre Pellepret, he was reviving the Knights Templar and restoring them to their original Johannite heritage. The Catholic Church wasn't super keen on this, and after Fabre Pellepret's death, the members of the Knights Templar said, "Yeah, we're done with that Johannite stuff. We're going to go back to being Catholic," and they did. And the Johannite Church, while its authority was passed on, bishop to bishop until the present day, the church as a coherent organization pretty much ceased existing at that point. And then in the year 2000, a gentleman by the name of James Foster out of Cincinnati acquired the lineage of Fabre Pellepret's Johannite Church and said, "This is really cool. Why is nobody doing this?" And kind of revived it. So then we've been growing steadily since 2000.
Okay. And how did you come to the Johannite Church?
The Da Vinci Code.
the Dan Brown novel.
Yeah, I know, yeah. I tell people that, and everybody looks at me like I got two heads. When the Da Vinci Code talked about the Gnostics, I didn't think they were very interesting. I didn't think that was something that I was interested in. I was kind of in a period of spiritual seeking from pretty much the time when I was a teenager to 2004 when that book came out. But the novel made me curious enough that I wanted to know more about the Gnostics and what they did. And so when I started researching and started finding other people who claimed Gnostic practices in the modern day, I became more and more interested. And I said, oh, okay, this isn't what I thought it was when I first heard about it from Dan Brown. Ended up getting on a forum back when we had forums in the heady days of the early 2000s, and got really involved and kind of skipped out on a lot of work reading forums. and I met a lot of interesting people, and I was involved initially with a church that had a lot of interesting ideas but no real world presence. It believed in the radical priesthood of all believers, whereas if anybody wanted to say that they were a priest in that particular church, then they were, which, as you might imagine, didn't go over so well in the long term.
Seems like it would lead to some conflicts.
It did, and that kind of imploded. And through the forums and other conversations with people, I met and had a favorable opinion of a lot of the people who were in the Johannite Church, and so I said, yeah, I think I'm ready to start this process and to learn more. At the time, in the Boston area, there was no Johannite Church, and so I am too stupid to say no to things. So I said, well, if I want to belong to a Johannite Church and there is none around me, then I guess I got to start one. So I applied for formation and for the seminary, and it has been going ever since.
Okay. And what is it about the Gnostic worldview that makes particular sense to you, or that you connect with on a personal and spiritual level?
Mm-hmm. The way that the Gnostics are pretty open about, like, the world kind of sucks. I mean, there's a number of things that are nice and pretty, and I live in New England, and it's about to be fall, and you'd be hard pressed to find a nicer time of year and place to live, but it's still pretty awful. Kids still get leukemia, and people blow up buildings, and there's a lot of awfulness in this world, and I've never had a really satisfactory answer to why that is until I ran across Gnosticism, and if you understand the world as less than perfect to begin with, then that eliminates all of that, confusion about why does God let good things happen to bad people. And God really isn't letting it happen. It's that there is a flaw in the design. And so that, for me, is what makes Gnosticism right for me.
Okay, so the bad in the world was built in because the creator being the Demiurge was itself not perfect.
Right.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that gives people a good sense of kind of the Gnostic worldview and Gnostic practice. There's a lot to it,
Sure.
as I discovered. So there's a lot more, and maybe we'll link to some various resources people can check out if they want to learn some more. So thank you very much for joining me. It's a fun chat.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, and take care.
All right. Have a good day.
You too.